Our characters for today are twofold, coming from two different portions of Israel's history. The first one is maybe one that you may not be very familiar with, but we will see a couple things, at least a little bit about him. Probably spend more of our time on the second one, named Eli, who is more known. Jeremiah chapter 38 and 39 is where this first man is from. His name is Ebed-Melech, or something along those lines, is the best you're going to get from me. He was an Ethiopian eunuch who lived in Zedekiah's time, who was around, Israel, or the royal area, whatever, however you want to put it. And he was somebody who helped Jeremiah during Jeremiah's ministry. And as I've said many times, the ministry of Jeremiah is a tragic one in a lot of ways, because he was told by God to go preach God's word, and all of God's people couldn't stand him, didn't want anything to do with him. In fact, more than just not wanting anything to do with him, they wanted to actually harm him. And we don't read, I could be wrong, but as far as my memory serves, there's not a single instance where one of Jeremiah's own people was actually overly good to him, or good to him at all. And that's why he had such a hard time, because for God's prophet, speaking God's word, the people that you would think would be the best audience would be God's people. And yet, they did not want to hear it. They didn't want to hear what he had to say. But then throughout Jeremiah, the book of Jeremiah and his ministry, there are some people who pop up who were good to him, who actually helped him, who actually had compassion on him. And one of them was this man. He was, like we said, he was an Ethiopian in the service of the king of Israel to some extent, in some way, at least in the vicinity. And in Jeremiah chapter 38, verses 7 through 12, actually, if you go back before that, the first 6 verses, Jeremiah preaches the word, and then they throw him in a well. And an interesting picture in verse 6. They took Jeremiah, cast him into the cistern, or the well, which was in the court of the guard, letting Jeremiah down by ropes. And there was no water in the cistern, but only mud, and Jeremiah sank in the mud. So there's Jeremiah, sinking in the mud. It's like it's something that actually happened, but it's also like a symbolic picture of his ministry as a whole, sinking in the mud. Nobody to help. But then in verse 7 we read this: when Ebed-Melech the Ethiopian, a eunuch who was in the king's house, heard that they had put Jeremiah into the cistern, the king was sitting in the Benjamin gate, Ebed-Melech went from the king's house and said to the king, "My lord the king, these men have done evil in all that they did to Jeremiah the prophet by casting him into the cistern, and he will die there of hunger, for there's no bread left in the city." Then the king commanded Ebed-Melech the Ethiopian, "Take 30 men with you from here and lift Jeremiah the prophet out of the cistern before he dies." So Ebed-Melech took the men with him and went to the house of the king, to a wardrobe in the storehouse, and took from there old rags and worn-out clothes, which he let down to Jeremiah in the cistern by ropes. Then Ebed-Melech the Ethiopian said to Jeremiah, "Put the rags and clothes between your armpits and the ropes." Jeremiah did so. Then they drew Jeremiah up with ropes and lifted him out of the cistern, and Jeremiah remained in the court of the guard. And then there's another reference to him in the next chapter. That God told Jeremiah, "Go and say to Ebed-Melech the Ethiopian, thus says Jehovah of hosts, the God of Israel, behold, I will fulfill my words against this city for harm and not for good, and they shall be accomplished before you on that day. But I will deliver you on that day, declares Jehovah, and you shall not be given into the hand of men of whom you are afraid. For I will surely save you, and you shall not fall by the sword, but you shall have your life as a prize of war, because you have put trust in me, declares Jehovah." So this man, he's repeatedly referred to as an Ethiopian, which among other things, would mean he wasn't a Jew, wasn't a Hebrew. He didn't come from a people who served the God of Israel, the true God, but he did. And he, again, is the only person that was good to Jeremiah. Not the only person, but one of the only people who was good to Jeremiah, one of God's servants, and helped him. And that alone is pretty high praise, coming from a people who were obviously going to be idolatrous, and among other things. He was different. He was transformed. Something was different about him. And again, that's one of the reasons I love the book of Jeremiah, because it's so ironic that he's thrown in there. Not a single person cared about Jeremiah. They were going to leave him there to die. That was probably their purpose. The sooner he's dead, the better, because we're sick of hearing him saying these things that we don't like. But this man goes to the king and says, they've done wrong. This is not right. We should save him. And the king listened, and so he saved Jeremiah's life. So just some lessons, a little bit different than the way we have normally done it, but straight from the book that we're using that's on the handout. Among the lessons to be learned here, Ebed-Melech was superior to his surroundings. He was better and bigger than those around him. He put more pretentious people to shame. I wonder how many people knew Jeremiah was in there and didn't say a word. There were probably some who wanted him to die down there. There were probably some others who didn't really want him to die, but weren't concerned enough to say anything. And then there was him, who actually did say something, who cared enough. He had the courage of his convictions. Again, same thing we just said. He actually went through with it. He didn't just feel sorry for Jeremiah. He said, this is wrong and we should do something. He had a kind way of doing kindness. We see that with him. Even in the execution of saving him, he was helping him, giving him, put these rags or clothes between he provided these things instead of just pulling him up without a care, probably would have hurt quite a bit or in a more painful way. He made a way for him to be lifted up more comfortably and carefully. He achieved a great service with poor instruments. That's more of a commentary on God than anything. God can use weak things for the accomplishment of great things. Number 6, his faith in God was the secret of his noble life. We learn that in chapter 39, like we just read. God saved him, much like Rahab. I'm destroying the city, but you're going to be saved. Much like Lot with Sodom and Gomorrah. Destroying the city, but I'm going to save you. I'm going to punish this city, but you, Ebed-Melech, which by the way I didn't say, but means servant of the king, or possibly servant of Melech. Melech, I guess, means king, so could be either one. And finally, he was divinely rewarded, like we just said. God is a grand paymaster. Very true. Any comments on him? What's that? Yep. God saw. And he obviously, like he said, he had faith in God. At some point, he started having faith in God. Maybe it was because of Jeremiah's preaching, for all we know. Very well could have been. But it's sad whenever somebody who comes from outside of God's people makes God's people look bad. And that's exactly what was happening in this case. Yep.
Well, we see through the Bible different individuals that weren't Jews that are mentioned that had faith in God.
Yep.
And even in the New Testament, especially with Cornelius, he was, and like there's other ones, right now, but in the Old Testament, that they did have faith in God. And like you said, Rahab was one of them. And there's others mentioned, and that's just it. We know that even though the law of Moses was for the
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, it's kind of maybe an interesting point that the text doesn't necessarily say that this man had become a Jewish proselyte, but he had faith in God. Now, maybe that means that, but, it could also be that he was like Cornelius, like you said, somebody who was operating under the, natural law or whatever we want to call it, even though he wasn't among the Hebrews. But he certainly put the others to shame. And Jesus pointed that out in other people when he said, I haven't even found this kind of faith in Israel. And you can imagine the Jews didn't like that kind of statement very much. He also pointed out to the Jews that how many Israelite widows did God send Elisha to? 0. But he sent them outside of Israel. He sent him outside of Israel to the woman at, Zarephath, I think it was. He was trying to make a point. And it's the point that, was just made. He hadn't forgotten. And even they can be faithful to him, and this man was. Okay, that leads us here. Eli. Who is Eli? Well, Eli, whose name, by the way, means one of a few different things. Take your pick. Could mean God is exalted. Could mean high or lofty or ascension. Or it could mean my God. And I am a little bit partial maybe to the first one, because the first one that's listed, because if you remember when Jesus was on the cross and he cried out, the first 2 words that he said, although Matthew's words it a little bit differently than Mark's, was Eli, Eli. And what was it that he said? My God, why have you forsaken me? So that seems pretty clear to me anyway. Of course, I'm no language expert, but like I said, the other account spells the word a little, adds 1 letter, so maybe that is the reason, maybe that explains why that means my God, and maybe Eli's name doesn't mean my God. But either way, doesn't matter. He was the high priest, and in some capacity a judge. He was said to judge Israel. He wasn't said to be one of the judges per se, but he judged Israel in some capacity, as did Moses in some capacity. But his legacy was really not being a great father in some way. He maybe it's unfair, but somehow his sons turned out to be wicked, dirty, evil men. And it was to his great shame. It broke his heart that his sons were the way they were, and he maybe didn't do enough. Or, well, we'll see. We'll see when we read the account. We first meet Eli in 1 Samuel, which doesn't have anything to do with Eli. 1 Samuel is, at the beginning, records the birth of Samuel. And his mother, or his soon-to-be mother, Hannah, was at the temple praying extensively, pouring out her heart, and then the priest walks in and thinks she's drunk because she's just mouthing, and maybe from his perspective it looked like nonsense or something. But she said, no, I haven't drank anything. I have just been pouring out my heart to God, to Jehovah. That's when we first meet Eli. And in the first few chapters of 1 Samuel, we learn a little bit more about him. Samuel obviously was going to be dedicated to God in the most extreme sense. He would be basically raised at the temple, and Eli would be a big part of his life. But after Hannah's prayer in chapter 2, we read this, beginning of verse 12. Now the sons of Eli were worthless men. They did not know Jehovah. Now, it's a verse that kind of comes out of nowhere, but it is very relevant to how this thing pans out. It goes on, gives some description about some of the things they were doing, sort of not taking the temple duties seriously. And it says, thus, in verse 17, the sin of the young men was very great in the sight of Jehovah, for the men treating the offering of Jehovah with contempt. And that's the ESV, but some versions seem to translate that in a way that means they were doing it so disrespectfully and in such a way that the people started viewing the offering of Jehovah with contempt. So it's unclear which one's right, but at any rate, they were wicked, worthless. That seems to me, at least in English, one of the biggest insults. You know, you could call me, people have called me all kinds of things. And, you know, I try to take it as much as I can. But it would really hit me hard and sting if somebody called me worthless. Because surely, I might be stupid, I might be mean, I might be arrogant, I might be a lot of things. But surely I'm not worthless, totally worthless. Of course, in this sense, it is... That word is used a lot in, or maybe not a lot, but in Proverbs and other places, and kind of characterizes somebody who is just up to no good all the time. No good, evil, wicked, corrupt. Eli's sons. Now Eli wasn't a corrupt priest. He wasn't a corrupt man. But his sons. Here's the picture of his sons. Now, it says, verse 22, now Eli was very old, and he kept hearing all that his sons were doing to all Israel, and how they lay with the women who were serving at the entrance to the tent of meeting. And he said to them, why do you do such things? For I hear your evil dealings from all these people. No, my sons, it is no good report that I hear the people of Jehovah spreading abroad. If someone sins against a man, God will mediate for him. But if someone sins against Jehovah, who can intercede for him? But they would not listen to the voice of their father. The rest of that verse, it's a little more complicated, but we'll just let that slide for now. But here's the ordeal. Eli, it seemed. Now I don't want to cut him short, or sell him short. Something seems to be wrong with this picture. How is it that these men, they were grown up now, could so collectively, utterly disregard the words of their father? It seems that he just didn't command any respect from his sons. And that's where we could, speculate. How could that be? It doesn't necessarily mean that he did a terrible job fathering them, but it also doesn't mean that he didn't do a terrible job fathering them, or maybe lacked in the capacity of a father because they had no respect for him. Yeah, Dean?
Well, Eli complaining, my God, we know that he was a godly person. And I'm sure that he spent a lot of his time, since he was a priest, to the service of God. And maybe at one, the son, as he did not spend enough time with them, he was always going to God to pray and all that. They resented that. We see a lot of times with children even today, if the parents are not paying enough attention, they resent it. Now that could be the case here, I don't know. Because we know that Eli was a very godly man. And he was a priest, and that he didn't do anything wrong, but his children did.
Yeah. You can sometimes see and I'm talking about mainly children here, by their behavior, like maybe if you're a teacher or you work at a school, and by the way they behave, or maybe a daycare, the way that a certain child behaves, you kind of get some ideas. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, too, sometimes, we or the other people around me, like say, your children, he's a preacher's son, let's let him slide.
Yeah.
And so sometimes that
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. They say preacher's sons are the worst. So, is that true? I don't think so, but that's what they say. But anyway. Just kids?
They were called PKs, preacher's kids.
Oh, so it's the daughters too. Well, I can be on board with that one then, yeah. With kids though, like I was saying, if you are, maybe you're a daycare worker or something and you see the kids acting in a certain way, you can there are always exceptions, but you can tell. And you see that kid's a spoiled little brat. You can see it. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that. Maybe they just are troubled and the parents have done everything in their power and the kid just cannot be contained, but that's a very rare exception. Usually, you can tell when a kid is spoiled. And what does it mean to spoil the child? It doesn't mean just one thing. There's a couple different things. Well, maybe not a couple. There are a few. What's the first thing you think of when you think of spoiling?
My mom said something set on the shelf and left unattended.
Okay, so that would be negligence, really. What's another one? Entitled. Okay, so you give them everything. See, that's what I think most people think the first thing. They get everything they want. But then the other one that kind of goes along with it, and it might be what Joe was thinking of, they're not restrained. They're not stopped. Now look at 1 Samuel 3:13. I said we could speculate, but we can only speculate so far because listen to what verse 13 says. This is when God is he's making a declaration about Eli being rejected, his house being rejected. He said, I declare to him that I'm about to punish his house forever for the iniquity that he knew, because his sons were blaspheming God and he did not restrain them. There it is. What was Eli's problem? I highly doubt this was the only matter in which Eli was failing to restrain his sons. It's more likely that this was a pattern of failing to restrain them. So when that is what, going back to the daycare illustration, that's what makes a child behave differently than other kids. As a rule, again, there are always exceptions, as opposed to the other kids, is because they're not ever restrained. So at home, they might just go wild and crazy and backtalk the parents and throw fits. And if the parents don't restrain them and put an end to it, which there are plenty of ways to do, spanking's one. Sorry to say. That's not offensive in the South, okay? Maybe it's offensive up here, but it doesn't work with every kid, but it does work with most. But doing something. I never have been a big proponent of this timeout business. I wish we had timeout when I was a kid. I'm sure you do too. We didn't have timeout. I wasn't beat near as much as I should have been, but yeah, the kid, really when there's timeout, the kid calls all the shots. Timeout, that's not a punishment. Oh, I get to sit here in the corner? Okay, cool. That's not going to deter me next time. Go to your room. Now, we do the go to your room a lot, but I'll just make a confession. That's more for us than for them. Go to your room because we're sick of seeing you and hearing you. But I don't think it bothers them too much, but that's what happens when you're running out of options. But restraining them somehow, punishing them, Eli seems to have not done a whole lot of that. He didn't. I mean, to his credit, we do read him this rebuke of them. He did that much. But, I think sometimes there is such a thing as too little too late. At least he did that. But, again, we're reading it from a page, so we don't know the demeanor, the tone. It may have been a very weak and pitiful effort, like not taken seriously. At any rate, we know they didn't take him seriously. We just don't know why. But what we do know is he didn't restrain them. And because he didn't restrain them, this is how they turned out to be. And it's sad. But now here he is. What can he do? He missed his opportunities, I mean, that's why parenting is such, I mean, it is not to be taken lightly. It is a big responsibility, because there will come a time, I guess, when you do it right, and nobody's perfect, but when you generally do it right, there's never going to be a time in that child's life, even when they're 30, 40 years old, when your word will not be respected to them. They might not obey everything you say, but, if we want to get, I mean, I guess it's a debate we could have. The concept of submitting to your parents is there's not really a line drawn in Scripture of when that's supposed to stop. We've made up, my roof, my rules, that kind of thing. But anyway, we'll leave that for another time. At any rate, you should at least respect something that your parents, if they give you some advice or say, this is probably something that you ought to do, even if you're 40 years old with your own family, would it be a bad idea? I mean, provided that it's not sinful advice. Maybe, I mean, the respect is there, and it impacts you. Didn't for him and his sons, because he blew it when in their formative years. Yes, sir. What verse? Of chapter 3 or chapter 2? Oh, chapter 4? 98 years old. Yeah, he had 98 years. Nobody in this room's had that many years to try. But yeah, I've always kind of pitied Eli a little bit. I mean, again, give credit where credit's due, but don't disregard the mistakes, because they're both, I mean, he's human. So that is what being human is a lot of times. You do some things right, you do some things not so right. But it's just a sad situation, because here he is in regret. Yep. Same thing. David was a great king, but he seemed to be lacking in the father department. And I think Eli's the same. He was a great high priest. Notice, God isn't removing the priesthood from him. He's punishing his house. And why would the priesthood be taken from him, from his house, is because of who his sons were. They're not fit to be having anything to do with the priesthood or the work of God. So now here he is, an old man, and he's hearing all these things that his sons are doing. Awful things. Terrible things. Treating the worship of God with contempt, lying with the women, there. It was just awful. And he's hearing from the people about these things, and it's breaking his heart. But at the same time, there's only so much he can do for them. Now, at the end of his life, again, it's a tragic situation. The people are going to go up to battle, and Eli was real nervous about this, and they lose the battle, and the Philistines take the Ark of the Covenant. The worst thing that could ever be imagined to happen. Because unlike today, back then, the Ark of the Covenant, it wasn't God, but it was sort of like it was sort of a symbol. The closest thing, a symbol of God, and God sort of said, my name, he is kind of where that thing is. Not like an idol, but just this thing is important because God said it's important. Now, they were to understand that when they took the ark, according to God's instructions, God would be there fighting with them. But if they did it differently and without God's authority, the ark had no power. Well, that's what we see happening here, and they take it. The enemies take it. So it's like it's almost like they've taken God from us because they've taken the ark of God. So in verse 12, beginning verse 11, it says the ark of God was captured. And two of Eli's sons, or the two sons, it doesn't say two sons earlier, but now it does, died. Go ahead, Dean.
Well, the thing is, the Ark of the Covenant, what it contained,
Yeah,
and also the showbread and
the staff of Aaron, yeah. Yeah, so,
and so, I mean, you know, it was representing the God, but you don't know what it contained in that Ark of the Covenant.
yep. And by the way, nobody knows where it is today. Never will. You can imagine how easily it would be for that to become an idol. Imagine if somebody had the staff of Aaron that budded today, and how much that thing would be worshipped. Or the manna, that they kept, or the tablets. But anyway, getting off track there. So, verse 12 of chapter 4 says, a man from Benjamin ran from the battle line and came to Shiloh the same day with his clothes torn and dirt on his head, mourning. When he arrived, Eli was sitting on his seat by the road watching, for his heart trembled for the ark of God. And when the man came into the city and told the news, all the city cried out. When Eli heard the sound of the outcry, he said, what is this uproar? Then the man hurried and came and told Eli. Now Eli was 98 years old, and his eyes were set so that he couldn't see. And the man said to Eli, I am he who has come from the battle. I fled from the battle today. And he said, how did it go, my son? He who brought the news answered and said, Israel has fled before the Philistines, and there has also been a great defeat among the people. Your two sons also, Hophni and Phinehas, are dead, and the ark of God has been captured. And as soon as he mentioned the ark of God, he fell over backward from his seat by the side of the gate, and his neck was broken, and he died. That came out of nowhere, didn't it? Didn't see that coming. Maybe you did, but it says, for the man was old and heavy. I guess that's why his neck broke. He was first of all, he was 98 years old. Second of all, he was old and apparently heavy. So he was already fragile, and the weight of himself caused he broke his neck. But here's what fascinates me about that verse. It's this man brought him two big pieces of news. One, the ark of God has been captured. Two, your sons are dead. Now, which one of those two would hit you the hardest? Which one you think? If it was you, just you. Son's dead. That's the one that would hit me the most. But Eli, no. Look at what it says again. As soon as he mentioned the ark of God, Eli fell over backward. That's what caused that. That's what hit him so hard. So I point that out because that seems to be indicated as the main thing that hit him so hard that he physically actually fell out of his seat and broke his neck. So it's just sad. The ark of God being taken was so awful for him, so tragic that, and it's similar. This whole chapter is sad because not to get off of Eli, but his daughter-in-law was pregnant and she was giving birth, and she was dying in childbirth, and she named this child. She was sort of hysterical and kind of out of it because she was, like I said, she was giving birth and losing her life, it says, about the time of her death. And she named the child Ichabod, saying, the glory has departed from Israel. So same thing here. Here she's dying and giving birth to this child, but the last thing she's thinking about is the ark of God being taken. And that's the same place Eli was in. He's just been told his sons are dead. But the thing that has broken his heart even more is the ark of God's been captured. So it's like sorrow upon sorrow for Eli, and mostly because he was old and he couldn't turn back time. Now, that's not to say that everybody we've already made this point in other lessons. Not every good parent has good children. Not every godly parent has children that turn out to be godly also. And when I say godly parent, I don't just mean within themselves, but a parent who has raised their children in a godly way does not guarantee that they will grow up to be godly. There's a very much higher chance that they will, but doesn't guarantee that. And the reverse is true also. Just look at Ebed-Melech that we already looked at. He's a perfect example of somebody who obviously did not come from a family who raised him up in the admonition of Jehovah, but he grew into that. Well, the problem with Eli in his case is that we do read, at least in that one instance, that he did fall short in restraining his sons as they were growing, and that had an ongoing effect, never stopped. That lack of respect never stopped. However old they got, even when their dad was an old, frail, 98-year-old man, still didn't seem to have any respect for him. So, here are some lessons from Eli. Parents should have authority or rule over their children. Period. Inasmuch as is physically, humanly possible for them. And if there are other issues with the child, then there are ways to seek other help for them. But it's crucial to figure out what the problems are and to maintain that authority and command over your children, because it will affect them for the rest of their lives. Number 2, sin warrants rebuke, especially when found in those in our circle or under our care. So here's where Eli deserves credit. He did at least, as he's hearing about all these things, finally did rebuke them, as weak and pitiful as it may have been. He did at least say, people shouldn't do this. You ought not to do this, the stuff you're doing. People are talking, and you're bringing shame to yourself and to me. It is no good. At least he did that. Jesus said, when somebody sins, rebuke them. When your brother sins, rebuke him. If your brother sins against you, go and tell him his fault. In other words, rebuke him. Proverbs talks about offering rebuke to wrongdoing. Not everybody will accept it, but at least you gave it. But especially when it's people right in our inner circle, the people I'm with every day, especially my family, and especially my children. Rebuke, because that's how people learn, especially kids. Because kids lack self-restraint. That is part of the nature of being a child. You lack self-restraint. So when you lack self-restraint, what do you need? Unself-restraint, right? Whatever. Other than self-restraint. You don't have self-restraint, so you need restraint. Just like you don't have self-discipline. Some people don't have very good self-discipline, so they operate better with some discipline. Somebody outside of themselves to say, do this and this and this and, that kind of thing. Other people have self-discipline. They can sort of motivate themselves and keep that going. Same with restraint. So especially when it's our children or those under our care, sin warrants rebuke. And when we fail to do that, we are doing them a great disservice and harm. Finally, number 3, for God's people, God's family should take precedence over their own. The people of God should take precedence over the people of me. And I say that, in Eli's case, he should have done more for the sake of the people of God even than have his sons in their condition being a part of this, bringing shame on the people, doing harm to the people. But also, he knew that he couldn't go on indefinitely ignoring his sons' sins because they were his sons. He should have manned up earlier, at least for the sake of the people and God, and put God's people over his own. But it seems that in a lot of ways he did do that. He was, like we said, he seems to have been a decent high priest and judge over Israel. He did it for 40 years. So whatever his capacity was. But our family, God's family, is infinitely more important. But part of that is making sure, doing everything that we can in our power to try to get our family to be God's family, so that they overlap. But as we said, and we sort of touched on it last week, all I can do is all I can do. Eli sure had regrets. He knew that there were some things that he could have done better, but he doesn't have that time anymore. It's gone. It's past. But he could have stepped up then and done more than what he did. So forget necessarily did I do everything that I could have done, and get in the present and think, am I doing all that I can do now? That's what's important. It's the only thing that's important. I mean, if I messed up in the past, I repent of that, and then once I repent, then it's done. But now I'm in the now. We're always now. So am I doing all that I can do?